So with the animated Injustice movie coming out soon, it's had me thinking a lot about that story and how I don't really think it's a good Superman story now that I think about it. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of Clark Kent as a character, and I think of superheroes in general. So, for a bit of background, I've developed a bit of an appreciation for Superman as a character. I started watching more of his animated movies and I started the animated series, and Superman and Lois has also been a really great piece of Superman media. Before, I didn't really think much of Superman. I thought, like everyone else says, he's overpowered, he's boring. What can you really do with a Boy Scout with the power of a god, I'm going to get to those critiques in a second. But, if you've been living under a rock and you don't know Superman's backstory, basically who he is, where he came from, here's a quick crash course. Superman was born Kal-El on Krypton. His father was Jor-El, a scientist who saw that the world was ending very soon.
This planet will explode within 30 days, if not sooner.
I tell you, Krypton is simply shifting its orbit.
So he sent his son to Earth, where he knew that he would grow up under a yellow sun and better conditions on Earth, and he would be stronger than he could ever imagine being on Krypton. But before he sent his son away, Jor-El downloaded his consciousness into a computer, put it aboard the ship that sent his son to Earth. Cal landed in rural Kansas, and he was raised by John and Martha Kent, two normal, good folk, and they named him Clark. When he reached a certain age, he got to learn about Krypton and his true origin, and he got to learn from his computer dad. Then he moved to Metropolis so he could be a reporter, so then he would be the first to know if Superman needs to step in somewhere, as well as just using the power of the press to help out the little guy.
Luthor's been investing heavily in water rights. Kent's boring story.
And that's the general backstory for most adaptations. So getting to the critiques of the character that I mentioned earlier, he's overpowered, he's boring, what can you really do with a Boy Scout with the power of a god? First of all, Superman is a static character, so he doesn't usually have an arc in the traditional sense. He starts the story a good person and ends the story a good person, usually. Second of all, he isn't all-powerful. A lot of people like to say, well, he's just all-powerful. That's boring. That's boring for a story.
I think if I had done Superman, I would have done him differently. I would have made him more vulnerable. I think the idea of being able to do anything makes you a little uninteresting.
But he's not really all-powerful. He's really only as powerful as the story needs him to be. If he needs to have the power to lift a skyscraper, he can lift a skyscraper. If he needs to be weakened for a little bit, they'll find a way to weaken him. So why do the stories work? Because it's not really about him. It's not about how much he can lift. It's not about how fast he can fly. It's about how he affects the people around him. You don't watch a Superman story or read a Superman comic for some deep, dark inner conflict. The appeal is to explore how normal people react to a fundamentally good person with the power to change the world. Or I guess a better way of saying it is that it's about how people react to someone with that level of power, using that power for good and not using it for selfish reasons. That's what it's about. A person just not abusing power. That's the fantasy. Now, getting away from Superman for a minute, I think it's important to have an understanding of how superheroes have been portrayed in media. Superman's debut in 1938 arguably marked the beginning of the golden age of comics. Then the roster expanded, with Batman and Wonder Woman being introduced in 1941, and then even more so with the introduction of Timely Comics' Captain America. During World War II, a lot of stories focused on war, and then in the post-war era, it sort of shifted to crime drama. These were serious stories with violence and even death. For example, Batman killed people. This was way before the introduction of his one rule. But then came the Comics Code Authority, a group that was formed to sort of deter government censorship and public backlash, but in avoiding government censorship, the comics industry self-censored. Then the Silver Age brought us characters such as Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Avengers, and the formation of the Justice League. This also marked a change in the nature of superheroes. The colors were brighter, the concepts were more out there, and the characters were goofier. This is when Batman transitioned from a dark, gritty costume detective that sometimes killed people, to a brightly colored hero that less solved crimes and more pranks from his rogues gallery. And of course, with this, we got the Batman Adam West TV series and movie, the best adaptation.
Bon voyage, monsieur.
As well as what I call the Super Friends era. And I know it seems like these days the only way to sell a story featuring Batman and Superman is to have them fight each other, but I maintain that they should be friends. It gets all of that conflict out of the way and they can focus on telling any story. And that brings me to The Dark Knight Returns. After the 1960s Batman swung the pendulum to the goofiest extreme,
Hand me down!
The shark repellent bat spray!
Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns swung it in the complete exact opposite direction. Batman was turned into a violent, fascist, well, I'd say thin blue line, but that would be way too much color. He was turned into a thin gray line between Gotham City and apparent anarchy.
Crime is at a record high in Gotham, and no one seems to be doing anything about it.
YouTube video essayist Curio has a really great video that was an amazing resource in writing this video. It's called Monster Men Interpreting Superheroes as Monsters, and it goes into a lot of great detail, talking about The Dark Knight Returns. If you want a more in-depth analysis of why The Dark Knight Returns is very fascist, like I've talked about, I don't get into a lot of detail in this video, but if you want a great breakdown of it, check out that video, link in description. They also have a lot of incredible content on their channel. But yeah, the thing that I mentioned after this clip feels a lot like hyperbole, but yeah, if you watch that video and if you have an understanding of The Dark Knight Returns, it is not hyperbole at all. In the story, Batman even starts a gang populated with neo-Nazis to fight in his crusade against crime. And by the way, it's worth clarifying, this isn't like a commentary or anything. This is just straight up what Frank Miller would think would be cool. And this trend has sort of continued into the modern era. There's been a continuation of the darkening of superhero media. Just in the past couple decades, we've gotten the Dark Knight trilogy and the Zack Snyder era of DC movies. The Batman we have now is a brooding loner with specific plans on how he would kill each and every one of his friends, which is a real thing. You can look it up on YouTube.
Should any of the core members of the League turn rogue, we need to have plans in place to handle each and every one of us should we become a threat.
And it seems like the most popular type of Superman story now is the evil Superman story. To me, it often feels like a lazy way to show the old saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's as if the writer was saying, hey, what if someone could like punch really hard and shoot lasers? That sure would suck, wouldn't it? I bet they would. I bet they would do some bad stuff with that, wouldn't they? And it's like, yeah, that would suck. But that's not really the point of superhero stories, in my opinion. Obviously, we know that a lot of these superheroes, if they were real, it would be terrible. That's not the point. The fantasy isn't that these people have powers. The fantasy is that they're good. And Superman is that idea distilled. Superman's most iconic trait isn't his red cape or the logo on his chest. Superman's defining characteristic is that at the end of the day, he's a good, down-to-earth person. In Superman and Lois, there's one standout moment during his backstory where they recreate the cover of Action Comics #1, complete with a suit reminiscent of that era, one that I wish that they would stick with instead of defaulting back to the modernized CW-ish version. After returning a kid's hat, the kid says, hey, cool costume, and Superman replies,
Thanks. My mom made it for me.
That to me is a shining example of Superman acting in character. Regardless of all the power that he has, he's still just a wholesome guy. And to be clear and to get this out of the way, I actually do like Homelander and Omni-Man. I think they serve different functions as characters. To oversimplify, Homelander in part represents how certain iconography can be co-opted by individuals or groups with malicious intent and who use that iconography to put a veneer of patriotism over their brutal actions. And Omni-Man is a commentary on imperialism. I do think there's a place for that type of story, one in which a supposed hero turns out to be a jerk, assuming that it's done well, like in the case of The Boys or in... Alright, now with all that background, let's get into Injustice. Injustice started as a 2013 DC fighting game that just needed a premise that would have the Justice League fighting each other. An entire Elseworld narrative was started around this concept, with Superman starting a police state and Batman trying to stop him. It's a pretty complicated story, not just in the game. There's a whole prequel comic series that goes into the backstory, so check out Comic Storian's breakdown if you want all of that in detail. But the basic setup is that the Joker rigged a bomb to blow up Metropolis, and it's set to go off when Lois Lane's heart stops. Superman tries to stop him, but he gets a dose of Scarecrow's fear toxin, making him see Doomsday. Superman kills Doomsday, but then the fear toxin wears off and he realizes he just killed Lois and their unborn child. Enraged, Superman kills the Joker and decides that violence is bad.
I am calling an immediate worldwide ceasefire.
Well, unless he's doing the violence to stop the violence. That violence is good. Batman leads the opposing force trying to stop Superman's reign of terror, and every other superhero has to pick a side. Lex Luthor works with Team Batman to develop a pill that would give any human that takes it the power of Superman, because at the end of the day, it is a fighting game and they have to be able to be equally matched. I won't spoil the rest of the story, I just wanted to give the basic setup for it. That's all that you really need to know for this video. Now, I don't think Injustice is a bad story, but I will say it is fundamentally flawed in its portrayal of Superman. Every other Superman story that features Zod or any other Kryptonian or anyone that's trying to take over the world shows that Superman doesn't see himself as above anyone else, and he doesn't think it's his place to be some kind of God King.
This Superman is nothing of the kind. I've discovered his weakness.
Yes.
He cares. He actually cares for these Earth people.
And keep in mind, this is an Elseworld story, but it's not like Red Sun. It doesn't give him a completely different backstory. Everyone's backstory and personality is exactly the same as their canon counterparts, at least at the beginning of the story. So this is essentially, for all intents and purposes, this is that same wholesome Superman, but now he decides to start a police state. And by the way, speaking of the whole Superman killing the Joker thing, I wanted to say this in this video. I don't like the discourse in pop culture about whether or not superheroes should kill their villains or go full-on authoritarian to stop crime.
How many times did you catch this Joker? How many times did he escape to kill again?
First of all, the reason that Joker keeps escaping Arkham Asylum is because the writers decided. They just made it up. Every part of these stories is contrived by a writer, and I don't mean that with a negative connotation. I understand that it's easier to have the same villains just keep breaking out of jail instead of having to create a new villain for every story that you want to tell. Obviously, we wouldn't have Mark Hamill or Heath Ledger's Jokers if they weren't able to reuse this character endlessly. I just think it's important to be consciously aware of that, because it's a slippery slope to much more dangerous ideas if you have Batman really should kill the Joker somewhere in the back of your mind. Personally, I'm opposed to the death penalty, and I think police brutality is bad, actually. So the idea of someone that goes into the streets and brutally beats or potentially kills criminals in the streets, even if they are criminals, that sounds less like a hero and more like a serial killer or a potential terrorist. So looking back on this part of the video, I don't think I was specific enough about what I was trying to say. First of all, the idea of Batman going out into the streets and just beating up people, I think is a more modern idea introduced in like the Arkham series. I think that's a bad addition to the character to begin with, and introducing him potentially killing people would make that worse, actually. We have an admittedly flawed justice system, but a justice system nonetheless. The solution to violent crime has never been extrajudicial murder, and that's why I don't like the starting premise of Injustice. And keep in mind, this isn't some problem with just a bad guy acting like a bad guy. The story treats it like Superman is right to an extent.
They see a man that has toppled governments and created super beings to make an army. Hal argues, though, with Superman taking a more active role on Earth, countless lives have been saved, and not just through ending violence. They've been stopping hunger and creating a renewable energy source.
The Superman presented in Injustice is clearly an unhinged maniac, and it's evident that we're supposed to feel that way about him. So why do they have a character in the story make the argument that, hey, he may be doing terrible things, but he's also doing a lot of good things, and he's saving lives, and at least the trains run on time? I feel like that needed to be said, because there are a lot of people that think, oh yeah, Batman should kill the Joker. That would be so much easier. It would put an end to his crimes and his brutality. And I think those people miss that they're just stories. You know, this is a fictional person doing fictional things. Normally, if someone does the things that the Joker does, they're not breaking out of jail every week. I know it's a big side tangent, but it needed to be said. Now, it took me a while to think it over and figure out what would I do to make Injustice better if I was to write my own version of it. But I think I have some good ideas for broad changes to the story that would make it, in my opinion, a lot more meaningful and have it make more sense. My first major change is that I would swap Batman and Superman's roles. The story doesn't have to play out the same way, but I think if one of them is going to go astray and, go off the deep end, I think it makes more sense that it would be Batman. I think it makes more sense that Superman would be the more level-headed and decidedly not fascist one out of the two. Now, I don't like it, but it is integral to the story. The story doesn't work if one of them doesn't become a fascist that starts a police state. That's kind of what the whole story is about. So I can't really do anything about that. but just remember throughout the rest of this, I don't like the starting premise. Not to mention, and this is just an aside, the idea of Superman just snapping one day after something bad happens to him proves the Joker right in The Killing Joke when he says, all it takes is just one bad day to turn someone crazy like me. My interpretation, at least, of that story is that the Joker is wrong, and no matter what bad thing happens to you, you can still be a good person. I think that's the point of that story. And Injustice kind of retroactively undermines the moral of that story, and it proves the Joker right in a roundabout way. But with that in mind, I guess if it had to be one of them, I think it would be Batman. If you absolutely, gun to your head, had to argue that one of them could potentially be a fascist, I think it's a pretty easy decision. Comparing the two, the one thing that I've noticed is that in the opening action sequences of their movies, Superman tends to be protecting lives, while Batman tends to protect property. One example that I think kind of proves my point here is from The Dark Knight, which, take that with a grain of salt, it's The Dark Knight, but it opens with the Joker robbing a bank and generally being dangerous, and a lot of people could have died there. Batman didn't show up, but don't worry, he's there to stop the drug deal. And while Superman has super hearing that he uses to detect danger anywhere around the world, it's not something he asked for. It's just something that he has, non-negotiable, but he uses it for good. Meanwhile, depending on the adaptation, Batman has all kinds of surveillance equipment that he uses and was designed and manufactured by his own company that he owns because he is part of the corporate elite to spy on people throughout Gotham. And I think that's really the most important difference between Batman and Superman as characters. Choice. Batman trained his body and mind to be the ultimate weapon in his one-man war against crime. He even personally developed equipment and a suit of armor that would help him with this. Meanwhile, Clark Kent is just a normal, well-adjusted guy that just happens to be the world's most qualified Good Samaritan. He's basically if you had the heart and soul of this guy, in the body of this guy, and gave him the power of this guy. His costume was made by his mom using his baby blanket, and his symbol isn't something meant to inspire fear like a bat, it's just his Kryptonian family's symbol. Now, one of the big plot points of Injustice, the comic series, is when Superman joins up with Sinestro and starts using a yellow lantern ring.
Kal-El of Krypton, you have the ability to instill great fear.
Now, if you don't know, Green Lanterns derive their power from willpower, and Yellow Lanterns like Sinestro derive their power from fear. And to me, it feels like, why would Superman be the one to rule with fear and use a yellow lantern when Batman's entire theme and iconography is designed to strike fear into the hearts of criminals?
That's frightened me. This time my enemies shared my dread.
Fear is a tool. But when that light hits the sky, it's not just a call, it's a warning.
I also think the idea of Batman snapping after his love interest and unborn child are killed is more impactful than if it's Superman's. Sure, it's tragic either way, but Batman is generally more closed off, and he typically wouldn't allow himself to have attachments like that. Batman Mask of the Phantasm is a great exploration of this idea. Now imagine, after years of not wanting to get too attached to anyone, out of fear of that person being hurt by one of his enemies, Batman finally meets someone, he lets his guard down. Then the same attack happens. Batman is proven right. He doubles down on his old habits. Then he goes even further with it. Now, maybe he doesn't take over the world's governments like Superman does in the original story, but he amasses some level of power. He does what needs to be done, acting outside of the legal system and conventional morality. Then he starts a gang that kills criminals. This is starting to sound familiar. My version of Injustice would reflect Batman's real-world history as a character. His villains get more violent, Batman becomes more fascist, but this time it's explored through a critical lens. It's not just presented at face value as something that would be really cool if Batman did. While The Dark Knight Returns is about how cool it would be if Batman was a violent warlord that teamed up with neo-Nazis, Injustice could be about how maybe that's not a good direction for the character. But at the end of the day, this isn't really just about one story, and I don't want this video to just be a critique of Injustice. I think superheroes are really important culturally speaking. They're not just for kids, but they are primarily children's entertainment, and I think kids need heroes to look up to, whether or not they're real people. And characters like Captain America, Spider-Man, and especially Superman are, when you get down to it, just good people to look up to. And I know the whole what would Jesus do thing is a bit of a played out cliche, but I do think it's a good thought process. For Christians, it's what would Jesus do? For the rest of us, it's something like what would Superman do? And if you're Zack Snyder, it's both. Really, though, I do think it's important to have figures like that to inspire us to be better. Now, dark and gritty stories like Watchmen, The Boys, and are good deconstructions of the superhero medium and explorations of the real world violence that people with that level of strength would cause. But we don't need to turn Superman into Homelander or Omni-Man. Homelander is a dark reflection of what Superman could be. He has the same power level, but he was never nurtured. He wasn't raised by good people. He's essentially a cautionary tale. So why turn original recipe Superman into this dark reflection of himself? They aren't changing anything about his backstory, so it's essentially this guy doing a complete 180 and becoming this guy. What would Superman do? He would care for everyone. He would save kittens stuck in trees. And he would be an inspiration to young viewers.
I'm Superman.
But I think that gets muddied if that same character would also start a police state, kill half his friends, including a child, and start World War III. So I feel like I've spent a lot of this video talking about bad Superman media, and I kind of want to counterbalance that with some of my favorite versions of the character, some of my favorite stories featuring him. Now, I think these are all really good representations of the character. So first of all, Superman the Animated Series gives a great depiction of his origin in the first 2 episodes. It's a great depiction of the character overall. Superman and Lois is a great series about Clark Kent balancing being a father and being Superman. All-Star Superman shows Superman coming to terms with his own morality. Superman versus the Elite is about Superman fighting a group of new superheroes that try to take over the world in a very similar way to how he does in Injustice. It's basically the blueprint of how I would want Superman to act in my version of Injustice. So if you like this video, make sure you click the thing that says that you like it. Leave a comment if you have any thoughts on what I have presented in this video. I'd love to know if you agree or disagree, if you like the direction of superheroes getting darker. Obviously this is an opinion piece. This is my opinion. You're allowed to be wrong if you want. I have a podcast because of course I do, so check that out, link in description. It's kind of like a movie book club. Every week we talk about a movie. We've talked about The Suicide Squad. We're going to be talking about The Matrix in our next episode. But we also talk about other things. We talk about gamer news, any goofs and gaffes in the news. We talk about just whatever's going on. So yeah, go check that out and have a day.